Thank you. I'll just do a sort of quick overview of how we want to spend the next hour and a half with you all. So we'll start by introducing ourselves, of course, and explaining a bit more about this research. And then over the course of this afternoon, we are going to look at the insights that we gathered from the community businesses we spoke to, and also the insights from the funding and infrastructure organisations we spoke with. And for the last sort of half an hour today, we really want to give that space to questions and answers and discussion. And we really encourage discussion and dialogue. So please do keep posting your questions in the chat. We will be picking up on them. Before we get started today, I sort of just wanted to explain the flow of today's conversation and to say that whilst there are slides and we are presenting, we would really like today to be a dialogue and discussion. So over the course of the conversation we're going to have, I'll introduce you to everyone in the space. We will hear a little bit from Power to Change about how this research was commissioned, and also from Locality about how we work together in partnership. We'll move on to talking a bit more about the research approach, and then finally, of course, share some of the insights with you. Before I get started, I just wanted to kind of frame today's conversation, and this is something that we do in all of our events and in all of the conversations that we have, especially recognising that when we talk about marginalisation, as we are going to do today, everybody brings with them a different perspective, a different set of lived experiences, and everyone comes to this journey from a really different starting point. And so please do ask questions. It's absolutely okay to ask questions. That's why we're here in this space. But also, it's absolutely essential to hold space for each other's experiences. And there are a lot of different people in the room working across different sectors and different organisations, and we're going to have different perspectives, and we will absolutely hold space for that. But we also really encourage you to be brave and really to take part in the dialogue and the discussion. And please kind of reflect and share your experiences. Do keep using the Q&A, sorry, not the Q&A function, please keep using the chat box on Zoom to share your questions as we're going through. Summer will be picking up on them. And then I'll touch on one more thing, and this is, from our experience, is that quite often when we talk about marginalisation, people will have different lived experiences, and sometimes the topics, we touch upon can land on different people in different ways. They affect different people differently. If any of the discussions or the conversations or things that we're talking about make you feel uncomfortable, please do feel free to either message me or to step out of the room. And finally, we are recording today's session, and we're going to make it shareable to everyone that attends, and Power to Change will also be hosting it on their YouTube channel. So if you don't catch all of the conversation, that's actually absolutely fine. We will share it afterwards. So I've promised we'll do this about 3 times, so let's actually do this. We're going to start today with some introductions. So I'll introduce myself first, and then I will move on to introducing the other kind of research partners in the space. So my name is Ishita. I am, as I said, the founder and director of Spark Insights. Spark Insights is the research, the training, and the consultancy arm of a community business called Spark & Co. Spark & Co started I say way back because it's been a long few years, but not that long ago, back in 2020. We started as a pandemic response organisation, and we were delivering kind of response projects around mental health, digital exclusion, and accessing and navigating support services that were targeted primarily at racialised communities. When we started, the real kind of problem that we were trying to solve was around recognising that very many racialised communities and people that experience marginalisation don't engage with things like government and healthcare as other people would, and those services in some ways are really not set up to serve certain people and communities. So that is the problem that we kind of set out to tackle, and that we still tackle today. We still do that through our community projects, and then Spark Insights is our arm, where we get to work with some awesome clients and some awesome partners. So I will start with Locality first, who were our partner throughout this research, and hand over to you, Liba, to introduce yourself.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much, Ishita, and very glad to be here. I'm here with Rachel as well, who is representing Locality. So my role is as a project support officer. I'm based in London and been very glad to be involved in this since last summer. I will pass it over to my colleague, Rachel, so she can introduce herself as well.
Hi, everybody. As Liba said, I am Rachel. We've been really honored to be a part of this research, and it's been super useful from a locality perspective. I hope you can still hear me, by the way. My box was frozen for me, but okay. And we're also joined by a colleague, David Moynihan. So I'm a community development officer. David is our head of services for the South Services team. If you want to say a quick word, David.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to make it today because I was on leave. But yeah, really happy to be able to join, and we were delighted to be part of this research project. Just very briefly on Locality, for people who don't know us, we're a national infrastructure organisation. We support community organisations and kind of act on their behalf in terms of influencing government and other bodies. And yeah, so our role is to try and make community organisations stronger and more successful. So we're definitely kind of on the supply side of this when we kind of get into to looking at the findings. And yeah, so that's it from me. I mean, I'm head of services at Locality, as Rachel says. Thanks, Ishita.
Awesome, and I'll hand over to the team at Power to Change, who we've got here today as well. Edward, do you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So yeah, my name is Edward, and I'm the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Manager at Power to Change. I was one of the several people who had a hand in originally designing this research, and it's been really excellent to kind of watch it sort of, well, spark into life, I guess you could say. Terrible puns not included. I'm joined by my colleagues who I'm not sure if we're introducing or if just kind of are working behind the scenes, but we have Summer, who is helping to manage the chat and the overall function of it, and my colleague Rachel, who is the research lead on this, who kind of led with all of the management. I'm not sure if Rachel is introducing herself, but we are the Power to Change team collectively.
Awesome. Yeah, so Rachel and Summer have been very much on hand behind the scenes and are helping host today as well. But let's have a quick introduction, Rachel and Summer, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves.
Yeah, sure. I'll go first. Hi, Rachel, Impact and Learning Officer at Power to Change. And yeah, been really great to work on this project with Spark & Co. and also with Locality.
Hi, I'm Summer. I'm Communications Officer at Power to Change. I'm really excited about this piece of work. I know it's been in the works for a really long time, and as someone that's been at Power to Change for a few years now, yeah, this feels like a good time. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Awesome. And Summer's the one that's been posting in the chat, asking you all for your questions. So do make sure you send them across, because Summer will be picking them up for our Q&A later. So let's get cracking, because there's so much that we could share with you, and actually probably one of the biggest challenges in preparing for today, but also writing the report, was condensing the information, and we are going to try and do our absolute best to capture what the community businesses we spoke with really shared with us. But just to say that today will also be followed by the full report and a series of blogs and various kind of insights that you can read afterwards. I wanted to start a little bit by talking about who the community businesses we spoke to were, and why this was kind of really important and integral to the research. So the scope of the research was very much around understanding the experiences of community businesses that were led by or supporting people that experience marginalisation. And actually, what we found was we had such an overwhelming response from community businesses. So originally we were only going to speak to 20 organisations. We had 45 who expressed their interest to be a part of this research, and we ended up speaking with 27. And of the 27, what was really interesting is that the people, the individuals that we spoke to, whose organizations were serving communities that experienced marginalization, they also had their own lived experiences of marginalization. And we felt really privileged to be able to hear their stories and their experiences, and to really understand some of the nuances that their work and their realities involved. So over the course of this research, of the kind of community businesses we spoke with, 88% of them were led by racialized people. Of that 88%, 37 were Black-led community businesses. 8 out of the 27, so nearly a third, were led by people who are disabled, both visible and invisible disabilities. And 6 out of the 27 but were led by neurodivergent people. And I share that because over the course of the research, some of the insights that surface, I think you can kind of really sort of feel that they are rooted in those lived experiences. A couple of other things interesting to know about the community businesses that we spoke with. So in terms of their relationship with Power to Change, 60% hadn't previously applied to funding, 33% had previously applied but been unsuccessful, and a small minority, 7%, had previously applied and been awarded. Of their legal structures, 40% were community interest companies. And this was kind of a really interesting conversation point as well, because actually community interest company kind of surfaced as the top business and governance structure that community organizations that were led by people experiencing marginalization wanted to choose, because of the comparatively manageable amount of admin responsibility and the comparative ease in setting up in comparison to some other governance structures. Another really interesting kind of insight that we surfaced during this stage was around how people defined the link to their local community. So all of the community businesses that we spoke to had links to their local community, but actually only 55 of them felt that they could be defined by that link. And what people felt was that they were better defined by their link to a particular community, whether that was through a social issue, a cause, a faith group, or a particular characteristic. So people felt that their organizations were better defined by that link to the community itself, rather than to a particular local or physical area. And actually what we found was that people, when it came to making that connection, people didn't want to do it in isolation. So they wanted to be able to tell us both about their link to a local area, but also their link to a community. So this is kind of what we learned about our community businesses before we started the interviews. This was sort of knowledge that was gathered during the onboarding process for the interviews. I'll go on to share some of kind of the core insights that we gathered from those interviews. And then we'll take a bit of a pause and hear reflections from Power to Change and Locality on those. Again, I will say we do go into all of this in far more detail in the report and the exec summary, which will be online this afternoon. But I wanted to sort of provide a little bit of a snapshot into what we learned. What we did is, once we sort of spoke to those community organisations, we did a thematic analysis to really understand the barriers and the challenges that people were facing. And what we learned is that what community businesses are facing is an unprecedented demand on services. And really this feeling that they have is that funding and infrastructure organisations haven't come close to catching up to provide the relevant support and funding that's needed in 2023. A lot of the leaders that we spoke to described dealing with the whole new set of challenges and realities in a post-Brexit world, and in a world that's impacted by COVID. And things that they had sort of front and center in their minds were still the climate crisis, the cost of living crisis. So many people that we spoke to described both their organizational resilience, but also their individual resilience as being really affected, and is kind of being at all-time low. One of the people that we spoke to kind of said that they felt like they were constantly coming up to a cliff edge when it came to funding and support. And one of the kind of people that we spoke with, Rosanna from the Refugee Buddy Project, who I think I've actually spotted in the audience today, she told us we're going into a really horrible political climate in terms of racial justice and refugee and migrant rights. And we're going to need to be supported 100% by organisations that can fund or give guidance to organisations like ours, because it's just going to get more and more difficult. And so that was something that came out really strongly. And before we embarked upon this research, we did an evidence review where we kind of looked at 15 different sort of papers and reports, and to really kind of establish our baseline of understanding before we went into the conversations. And one of the themes that came out really strongly in that evidence review was, around that capacity challenge, and that capacity challenge is still very much there. It's just become even more complex in a changing world. So that was definitely one that came out strongly. A second one that we heard, especially from the people that we spoke to, is how much community organisations and businesses that are led by and supporting people that experience marginalisation feel really locked out by funding criteria. And what we kind of really learned was that community businesses are giving such great care and consideration to application criteria, and there's just this strong sense that it's not worth applying unless they meet the criteria to an exacting degree, and that they can robustly evidence this. Because they're so capacity stretched, there's definitely the sense that it's not worth taking the risk to apply to kind of funds if you're not very, very certain that you've got a good shot at getting it. Within this specifically, it was requirements around legal and governance structures, turnovers, track records, and impact, evidencing impact, the thresholds around that were cited as really common barriers. One person told us we are hovering just under the 100k turnover mark the funder requires, but I don't want to push myself to get to a higher turnover. I want to push myself to serve my community more. But there is definitely this kind of sense of a very uneven playing field, and sort of a history of persistent underinvestment into organisations that are marginalised has created quite an uneven playing field, where some of the kind of thresholds around turnover, around track record, feel really kind of high and difficult for community organisations. So that was kind of the second big emerging theme. The third one was around innovation. And this was a really interesting one, but there was sort of a sense of frustration from community businesses that because of kind of restrictive and competitive processes, there wasn't enough being done to foster the culture of innovation in the UK community business sector, specifically when it came to people experiencing marginalisation. And a lot of the leaders that we spoke to, they really expressed the desire to have the freedom to be able to bring new innovations to solve existing problems. But they warned that kind of the stifling and restrictive state of applying to funding at the moment was really sort of restricting that culture of innovation. We then come on to application processes, where we found that really people experience challenges from A to Z throughout the process from start to finish. They expressed that application processes for both funding and support were a strong pain point, and kind of recurring themes that came up were time, energy, data requirements, and use of language. This won't surprise very many of you, but there was a real sense of fatigue and frustration towards buzzwords, jargon, acronyms. And for many community organisations, the sort of style of language that is being used by funders feels like the language of an entirely different social group. And that kind of inaccessible language is essentially further reinforcing these sort of hierarchical and structural systems and these sort of systemic inequalities. Loads of interviews we spoke to sort of described not being able to describe their impact in the way that funders require them to describe their impact due to a lack of kind of quantitative data. Specifically on here, something that we really sort of heard from interviewees that were neurodivergent, disabled, and had chronic illnesses was around sort of the challenges that application processes pose for them. And actually what was really interesting is when we kind of dug deeper into understanding what the preferences were and what format people prefer to apply in, what we heard back was that there wasn't necessarily one format or one method that people wanted to apply in, but rather they wanted to have the freedom and the agency to choose what worked best for them, recognizing that actually those things that they're experiencing are not kind of binary or linear things. They can change over time and their preferences might change over time. So actually what people described was being able to have choice over how they applied to things. The fifth kind of big thematic area was very much around human contact. So community businesses we spoke with really valued human contact and kind of really strongly iterated that message that funders need to engage with human stories and human problems on a really human level. And this doesn't just help organizations to find out about funding and support opportunities, but actually it really supports them to feel confident enough to apply to them. So overwhelmingly community organizations kind of stressed how important that kind of really human engagement was. They wanted to see funders do things like get out and visit organizations and pick up the phone and have conversations with applicants. And kind of a big thing that got a big green tick from people that we spoke to were webinars and virtual sessions. So these things were received with great positivity and seen as tools that kind of meet community businesses at the middle and allow like a bit of that human engagement with funders. You know, really interesting little things came out from this as well. People kind of picked up on little things like some funders not having bios on their website. So actually when you get a grant manager, you have no sense of who they are, or you have no sense of where your information is going and why that person cares about your organization. But yeah, this was a really strong theme. Another one was very much around holding space for complexity and nuance. And actually there was some really kind of granular and complex things that community and businesses we spoke to described. So one of the people that we spoke to kind of described how the census data doesn't account for particular ethnic groups. And what that means is that it's actually really difficult to make the case of the support that group needs when it's not even included in the census data. Other people we spoke to described things like tribal differences within the community, and actually how some of these very sort of granular and nuanced complexities are conversations that they're not yet able to have with funders. And there was also like a real sense of protectiveness around this. So there was a real sense that funders were asking for quite a lot of information on things like protected characteristics or ethnicities of communities being served, but actually they lacked kind of the nuance or the ability to hold nuance for some of that complexity. Sort of building on that, another theme was very much around it being a two-way street. Something that we heard loud and clear from community businesses was the desire to kind of see more accountability for funders. And this was very much around funders building their own internal skills, their knowledge, and their capacity to work in more equitable ways. So some of the themes that we kind of saw in the conversations here was, you know, the desire to see funders address their own internal systemic imbalances, Trustee boards, as an example, were often cited as a perceived barrier for staff within funders who were trying to work more equitably. We had an interviewee describe one of their experiences working with a trustee board where they were described as too LGBTQIA, not by the staff within the funder, but by somebody on the trustee board. And actually it was really interesting how trustee boards were a recurring theme and very much seen by very many of the people we spoke to as one of the blockers. Community businesses were vocal and challenging of existing narratives and exclusionary practices within the grant funding and the social investment landscape. And, one of the questions that came up over and over again was kind of community businesses questioning why funders weren't using their own endowments and their own investment returns to invest into their capacity to do inclusion work more effectively. So one of the kind of interviewees that we spoke to us said, we know how much money there is at the top of the charity sector, and we know how little money there is at the bottom. Another interviewee said, funders have a huge amount of wealth. If some of their barriers are capacity or not having enough resources to truly support marginalised organisations, why aren't they taking some of their endowments and investing it better into their own organisation so that they can serve communities better? And that was actually really interesting to see kind of the challenge around that particular point. Excuse the typo on the screen, it should say 8, and that is the final theme that I kind of want to share from community businesses today, which is very much around how community businesses are evolving to support each other where funding and infrastructure organisations aren't quite supporting them. One of the things that we kind of really surfaced through this research was how important anchor organisations are. So smaller community organisations that we spoke to, they described working with anchor organisations who are a vital source of support, and these tended to be sort of more established community businesses that were acting as custodians and providing access to addresses or bank accounts or those, some of those things that you need in order to be able to apply for funding. And then on the flip side, we were actually lucky enough to have a couple of anchor organisations involved within this research, and for them, they were very much acting as those custodians because they felt that it was their responsibility to support that incoming generation of community leaders with common hurdles that kind of are really perpetuated by the formalities and rigidities of incorporation or application processes. So, one of the interviewees that we spoke to, they described, so they said, we're running out with a back alley of a social housing estate. We don't have an address or a bank account, but luckily a local organisation stepped in and let us run our funds through them. And then an anchor organisation we spoke with told us, we hold funding for smaller community organisations that don't have all of the legal stuff in place. But it then makes us look bigger than we are. But what can you do? Can you just turn your back? And so this was like a really interesting complexity that we got from the research, is actually those small community organisations and businesses that were led by people experiencing marginalisation actually really value the support and to some degree are reliant on these anchor organisations, which is the bigger organisations that are able to kind of make headway with funders, but that in of itself creates its own challenges. So very conscious that I've been talking for some time, so I will stop and I will pause. I know there's lots there, and we will share all of this afterwards, but before we kind of carry on with today's conversation, I just want to kind of take some time to bring power to change and locality into the conversation. So yeah, Edward, I'll start with you. So through the research, hearing back some of these findings, and I know that you've heard them so many times by now, but what really kind of stood out to you, and were there any surprises?
Thank you. And yeah, I've had the luxury of seeing the draft report, to see sort of the real sort of depth of narrative behind some of these, and so in answering those, I kind of reflected on that. One of the quotes from the report from the full report is lived experience is still seen by funders and organisations as marginal rather than central. And I can't agree with that more. The way that we're trying to really centralise the value of lived experience, the importance of the understanding that comes from it, in a way that is not tokenistic, is actually about sharing power, is actually about having impact, I thought really stood out as a theme of the overall research. And then one that came out was also it was touched on in the prior two slides. It was about funding criteria and application processes, which I kind of round up as our practices and processes, because they are realistically all of the things that we as funders are doing as requirements that we put on the applicants that we work with, and how much those processes and practices we have designed to serve us in ways that absolutely do not serve the audience that we are supposedly serving as applicants. And so it's that very clear, unambiguous and repeated critique of the way that those processes or certain elements of those processes can further marginalize, further increase the disparity that groups that are already challenged in accessing funding face. So I thought those were the real standout bits for us. It's quite difficult to choose any because it's all very, very useful stuff. For me, the only surprise that I think I had that wasn't reflected in these slides, because it drew from a series of quotes in the executive summary, which is being released, was about people's reluctance to identify themselves and identify their characteristics, and a belief that, the direct quote is, it's box ticking for funders, it's what funders want to hear. And for me, reflecting on that and the fact that we are very committed to trying to improve the diversity, the equity and the inclusion of our funding, and the way that we're trying to ask people to identify their organizations, the way that we're trying to understand disparity is so far beyond box ticking. It's difficult to communicate if that belief exists that we are just doing it as a tokenistic thing. And so it's a interesting series of challenges to highlight how are we communicating this? How are we as a funder, or how are other funders who are doing similar work separating themselves from the type of organizations that would just do this as a box ticking exercise? How do we best highlight that this has meaning for us? This has an impact on who we fund and how we fund them, and we are doing this as an active learning process in a way that really gets across that we're not just, we want you to tick this box for whatever reason. But it was surprising to hear that, not so much the distrust, because I can completely understand why grantees would say, oh, it's just box ticking, funders don't care, because to be quite honest, we've been great at not caring about these experiences for a long time. But that they don't wish to identify, and that itself, the disbelief or the disincentive to identify their own characteristics might be excluding themselves from the funding, was really quite a surprise, and not something we have thought about exactly how to challenge. So a good next step is dealing with it.
Yeah, I completely echo that. That was a really interesting learning, and I think actually, for us, understanding that community businesses will actively navigate away, not all of them, but definitely a contingent of the people that we spoke to will actively navigate away where they find those forms to be extractive. And actually, the sense that we got is it's very rarely one funder in isolation. It's the collective. So it's that collective experience of applying for multiple funding applications, multiple grant applications, multiple kind of support forms, and that fatigue that builds up from being asked that repeatedly and getting that sense that it feels like box ticking. So that was like a really interesting example of actually when community businesses signal to us that they would navigate away. Another one that came through the research, and again, we've not put into these slides, but actually it was around understanding the source of money. And something that kind of came out is how community businesses and actually people, when they are looking at actually really starting to think about the source of that money. And some of the topics that came around was around sort of decolonizing funding, and how do you look for funders where that the kind of like legacy of colonialism it isn't kind of filtered through their funding processes. But that was another really interesting one, and a couple of community businesses kind of described to us sort of navigating away from opportunities or funders when they felt like either that it was going to sort of be perpetuating that legacy of colonialism, or that it was going to be extractive about the communities that they served. But yeah, incredibly interesting. Thank you for sharing that reflection, Edward, and Liba and Rachel. I'll move on to you both. But yeah, as locality, in bringing that perspective in, what stood out to you both, and why did you sort of find this research to be important, or definitely kind of bringing in locality's perspective of the community business sector? I'd really love to hear kind of your thoughts and reflections.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ishita. And yeah, really interesting to hear the findings and everything from this so far. And yeah, I think Rachel can speak more to the what stood out in terms of the elements from the actual reports, and I will speak a little bit to the research and why it was so important and why locality got involved in this. So as a kind of community anchor organization and infrastructure organization, historically, looking at this in terms of where we've come from, there's been a lack of support, let's say, for these groups, for these marginalized community groups. And this is a lot to do with historical privilege, is the historical exclusion. We need to kind of understand the kind of framing of this historically as to why this has happened. So as all of us know, the sector is predominantly, let's say, white dominated. And this is something that is part of the reason why we felt it was so important to be involved in this research, to be able to highlight and to show that there needs to be some movement and progress and change around this. The kind of history of colonialism, I think you just mentioned it there, and also, you know, couple that with the kind of white supremacy culture that is something that we've inherited, is kind of one of the big reasons why the charity sector, I believe, is still quite white dominated, and is something that we have really kind of looked into in terms of the unequal playing field, the locks and the codes that exist, the pre-existing stigmas and various forms of bias that also exist. All of these are kind of historical remnants really of the past that are still playing out today in our sectors. So therefore, as a result of this research, we're kind of moving some of those, let's say, goalposts, almost a framework towards something where it's more anti-racist, based in anti-oppression practice, looking into dismantling some of these cultures that was just spoken of. And also the lived experience, which again has been highlighted, the fact that lived experience, especially when it comes to leadership and those in trustee positions, is quite poorly represented. And there's a kind of need there for more lived experience to be shown and recognized within spaces of leadership and management and trustee boards. So those are the kind of reasons really why it's so important to do the research. I'll pass it to Rachel to kind of explain more about what stood out in the actual report.
Yeah, thanks, Liba. I think in part because of that context and the fact that we have inherited a legacy of structural racism, a lot of the findings weren't necessarily surprising, though there were some surprises for us as an infrastructure organization, and I'll get to that in a second. But we've seen this confirmed anecdotally in our work, and so it's been really nice in a lot of ways to have a report that lays it out a little bit more explicitly. So for example, we've done projects recently working with organizations led by people from various marginalized communities to support them with bid writing. And we've seen the ways that some of these convoluted funding systems really impact negatively on groups that are not native English speakers, groups that are not led by native English speakers, for example, or people with other access challenges, the ways that unintentional but very pernicious racism can play into the process. We've heard from orgs that they don't feel like their applications even get read in some situations, that they've had funders come back to them and say, we really wish you would have included this. And they're thinking to themselves, I did include that. It was right in the middle of this question. And so they have some very real evidence that supports their perception that their applications are not getting read or fully read by officers selecting. And so orgs are happy in some senses to hear that this research is being done, but I do think they feel like they've been beating the drum on this alone for a while now. And that, speaking from the perspective of somebody in an infrastructure organization now, that infrastructure and funders need to get on board and caught up, and that it's, you know, well past time that we actually act on the findings. We also did an evidence review as part of this work, and found that a lot of the things that were being said in interviews have been written about and known for a long time. So the question then becomes, what is blocking our action on these things? Why aren't we collectively actually instituting practices to make a difference? The other thing I wanted to point out was that there were some really useful parts of the report from an infrastructure org perspective around organizations being stretched in terms of capacity, for example, and how this impacts on services we provide at Locality. And you can apply this to your org if you're also joining us as an infrastructure org today. But we probably need to think differently about the way that we provide support to organizations that are already completely stretched. Locality has been involved in a lot of Funder Plus programs, which initially seems like a great way to support organizations in addition to provide funding. But sometimes that Funder Plus support can actually become pretty onerous, where they're having to meet with an advisor and set aside time to do this extra developmental work on top of carrying out the delivery activities that they have been funded to do. So as we've been working on this report alongside Spark & Co., there's just been a lot of internal conversations reflecting on some of these things. And I hope and have no doubt that we will continue to do this and actually start to move towards action in shifting our culture, as Liba says, and in revising the ways that we work. In terms of takeaways from the funding and infrastructure organization findings, we really need to have an intersectional approach. So these things that Ishita mentioned around collecting data and how that can sometimes be reductive, that's something that, to be honest, we haven't fully figured out ourselves yet. We know that it's important to collect information about the organizations that we're serving, who they're led by, and the communities they engage with. We're not really super sure, I don't think fully, how to phrase questions in the best way, or what types of information we should be collecting to surface a plurality of differences instead of trying to sort people into boxes, which is never an effective strategy. Also, unintentional tokenizing, that's talked about a bit in the report. Infrastructure orgs and funders tending to work with the same kinds of organizations over and over. And this, to me, signals a lack of knowledge in the sector about what is going on elsewhere, what other ways of working there are, what other organizations are in the sector. So there's a lot of learning that we have to do to diversify our approach to partnership in general, and to make sure that we're partnering with a lot of different organizations and not just approaching the same orgs over and over. And then tangible practices we can do right away. So part of that is partnering with orgs, advocating for different funding requirements and more flexible arrangements if we are not funders ourselves, or even if we are, trying to change the funding landscape, and holding space within our organizations to address inequities faced by different marginalized communities, understanding that those inequities will be different in the cases of different communities, and then really trying to exchange knowledge and learn about how we can change our support structures to affect more equity across the places in which we work. So sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but there were so many different things to take away from this report. Key takeaway from us is we've done work, there's a long way to go, and that is actually exciting instead of a bad thing.
Absolutely, thank you so much, Rachel. You're on a roll, so I didn't want to stop your flow, but there is certainly so much there that resonates, and I think will resonate with some of the people in the room. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share some of those sort of insights from funding and infrastructure organizations that you touched upon because actually something that was really integral and really important for us in this research is, as we were having those conversations with community businesses, to also be having those conversations with funding and infrastructure organisations. And we really value that funding and infrastructure organisations came to those conversations and shared with us their experiences and their perspectives, because we really did feel like it was so important to understand that, to, as you say, understand what is the blocker, like what is stopping us. And again, that there is a lot there. I was conscious that I really wanted to amplify the voices of sort of community businesses today. So we're not going to spend as much time on it today, but I do want to touch on sort of the core themes and say that these are kind of, we go dig a lot deeper into these into the research. But this is from conversations with funding and infrastructure organisations, and what we really wanted to do was understand their perspectives and experiences. So the first one was just actually how important it is to be able to align any work that you're doing with marginalised people and communities to your mission and your values as an organisation. And there was such a notable difference between organisations that were able to articulate that link between mission and values and how this kind of was related to or linked to their strategies to people experiencing marginalisation. On the flip side, where those organisations were unable to clearly link their strategies and their approaches to their mission and their values, there was like a general sense of kind of clarity and confusion. So actually, when you ask that question, what is our blocker? That is one of the blockers, is people not being able to really kind of articulate and understand why this work and why kind of proactively targeting marginalisation is an integral part of mission and values. You know, we could see on the flip side, you know, we had some organisations that sort of described tackling inequality like their North Star was the term that someone used, and someone, you know, also said our entire mission is creating a fairer future. So it's the thing that drives us. And actually, where the people we spoke to, where they were able to do that and really relate it to their mission and their values and their vision, the kind of organizational approach you could see was kind of far more articulate and far more nuanced, and there was that ability to kind of talk about accountability. But where we weren't able to link it back to the organization's mission, there was a real sense of confusion. And sort of in response to that, I guess another kind of core thing that emerged was the need to really focus on building confidence and knowledge and credibility for funders and infrastructure organizations. So interviewees that we spoke to sort of really recognized their own limitations around their personal knowledge, and also the discomfort of not having lived experiences. On the flip side, and we saw this with both funding and infrastructure and with community businesses, where people did have lived experiences, it was acknowledging that sometimes there was an additional pressure to be responsible for anti-oppression or anti-racism work as a result of those lived experiences, but also that a particular type of lived experience still doesn't mean that you're a knowledge, you hold all of the knowledge on the topic of marginalisation. And actually what it means is that there are so many different starting points and knowledge levels across funders and infrastructure organisations when it comes to things like equity and diversity and inclusion. And just one of the big challenges was getting staff on the same page and getting staff aligned. And really what we got was sort of within organisations, people bring their own perspectives and experiences, and when there's challenges getting people on the same page, that then sort of translates into challenges actually sort of working proactively on tackling marginalisation and translating that through to a set of actions, a set of accountable actions. Another one of those sort of limitations, like you touched upon, very much around data collection and management, and this was a really sort of interesting one. And there is, I think, sort of an interesting thing here that on the community business side, what we're hearing is these application forms are really stressful and they're contributing to our sense of overwhelm and burnout. And then actually on the funding and infrastructure side, what we're hearing is we don't quite know how to collect and measure and manage data around this. So what we heard was definitely uncertainty around what data to collect, kind of a lack of knowledge and a certain level of discomfort around how to frame questions and response options. So interviewees described things as simple as, like, you know, when you ask about ethnicity, what are the terms you're supposed to use? Like, what's supposed to be in the drop down? Like, definitely still some sort of questions around that. And then, like, a real kind of lack of clarity on how to balance data and the numbers with the lived experiences and the frontline voices, and that balance of perspective. So what the data is telling you and what lived experiences and voices are telling you, because there are sometimes going to be differences in those two things. And sort of one of my favorite kind of quotes from this is, there's a lot of data collection and impact reporting, but actually, do you really understand at a visceral level what communities are grappling with and what's happening on the ground, and what's really taking place and what's needed outside of what the report told you? And I think that speaks so well to that kind of complexity and that nuance. So there's challenges around collecting data, but even when you collect the data and you have the data, it's really understanding the bigger and the fuller picture. Another sort of big theme that we got, again, that came out strongly from both sets of interviews, was around developing trust with people and communities. And I can see that, you know, we've got a couple of questions about this in the chat as well. But, you know, there was like a real emphasis on the importance of just being really intentional and developing those long-term relationships, those deeper relationships that really help you understand people and communities and different types marginalisation. And I think, Rachel, something that you touched on that was sort of really sort of clear here was actually that over-reliance on a small group of people, on a small pool of partners. Interestingly, 7 out of the 10 organisations that we spoke to referred to the same partner when we asked them for an example of best practice with partnerships. And so this is really interesting, because the risk that it brings up isn't over-reliance on the same group of partners. And so it's not just how do you build partnerships, which very much came out as an effective and a tried and tested way of building trust. But how do you build partnerships that in of themselves are equitable and that allow you to reach people and communities and allow you to work in a way that doesn't put too much pressure on any one partner. But, you know, when it came to the topic of partnership, there were a couple of different types of partnerships that the interviewee sort of pointed to that are examples of what's been effective in this work. So specific expert partnerships with infrastructure organisations who have knowledge, reach and engagement in particular area or communities. And actually a really good example of that, potentially, in my humble opinion, is Spark Insights and Locality working together with Power to Change on this research. So obviously Locality brings that kind of perspective from an infrastructure organisation, a network organisation, and Spark Insights is able to bring that kind of deep engagement and relationship with people and communities experiencing marginalisation. And actually that type of partnership it is one that came through in the interviews as well. We also sort of talked about collaborative partnerships with other funding and capacity building organisations to share knowledge and best practice, and also delivery partnerships that allow organisations to work together on specific programmes or funds. So sort of we've seen this on various funding programmes where you might have a specific delivery partner that helps you engage a particular community in the process. But yeah, absolutely, partnerships emerged as a strong sort of theme. So what I'm going to do is, just because I'm conscious of time and I want to make sure that we hold lots of time for questions, is I will go through the recommendations and then we'll hold space for a few more reflections from Locality and Power to Change and kind of go into questions. So some of our recommendations, well, all of our recommendations were really rooted in what we heard from both community businesses and funding and infrastructure organisations. So we've tried to create a real balance of recommendations that are short-term and long-term, but ones hopefully that, you know, tread that line of sort of feasible and pragmatic, but also really kind of centre what the community businesses were telling us. Starting with just how important it is to adapt language, image use, and video use. So community businesses described just the real sense of fatigue and frustration around jargon and acronyms. And I think if it's one thing that I really want everyone to take away today is how much some of these things that we're talking about are essentially about rooting things in care. So it's not just that jargon and buzzwords and acronyms, it's not just that they lock people out, it's that they actively contribute to that sense of overwhelm or burnout that leaders of community organizations and that people that are experiencing marginalization are facing. So actually, if you're able to take away some of that jargon, if you are able to simplify application processes, what you're able to ultimately do is root some of those things in care, which is supporting those leaders ultimately to manage their well-being. Because I think that was one of the strongest things that we got from it, is it's not just about what the language says, it's also that feeling that it's creating in the person. But really, community organizations see language as a key signal and a key indicator of how seriously funding and infrastructure organizations are taking this work. And if you're not able to use the language that is reflective of the people and communities that you're speaking of, there's a real sense that you're not taking this work seriously. Images, this was also a really interesting one, and people wanted to see more authentic images, but they didn't just want to see representation of people experiencing marginalization. They wanted to see those in kind of assertive and leadership roles. And something that we did a roundtable exercise where we looked at a couple of images that was being used on the Power to Change website. And one of the things that was commented on is how very many of the people that were visibly diverse were kind of in passive roles. They were being spoken to, or they were serving people. And so it was also about understanding not just the image you're using, but what is that image saying? Like, what message is that sending? So actually doing that image audit and really thinking about the messaging around images is really important. Videos, so people generally were very positive about the use of videos. They wanted to see short and clear videos on how to submit an application, step-by-step videos, but also mentioned. And interestingly, case study videos that took people on a journey of different people in different communities applying to funding from start to finish. So the process of finding the funding, applying to it, what process they went on, how they actually got with the funding, and then what they did with it, rather than just, we got the funding and here's an impact video. So understanding that full journey. And we touched upon this earlier, but big tick for webinars and webinar videos that are accessible, subtitled, and kind of really explain things. A lot definitely came out on application processes, and I won't go into all of it today because a lot of this is in the report in more detail, but actually some of the big things were around allowing applications via different formats and really recognizing that accessibility requirements aren't a static or a binary thing. They change over time, and one person can have a different set of requirements today in comparison to 6 months from now. And actually really thinking about the information that you're asking for and the volume of information, because actually just the volume of documentation came out as a strong sort of barrier as well. In terms of capacity building, one of our suggestions was really around targeting that capacity building. So the three kind of areas where community businesses really said to us that they wanted to see more targeted capacity building was around early stage setup. So what you actually need to know to set up, your key considerations, what you need to have in place. The second thing was around legal and governance structures. And this is a really big one, and this needs to be kind of really relevant and tailored, because it was recognizing that actually some of the barriers to people that experience marginalization are not the same as they might be for a different organization within corporation. And some of the barriers that came out were things such as people being fearful to disclose their address to Companies House, or people being fearful of taking on that responsibility because of what it might mean for their personal circumstances. And actually, so any capacity building around that needs to be really kind of tailored to understanding some of those experiences. And then financial management was also a really key one that came up. Alongside those, another one that came up was social capital. And actually, there was this real sense, and Liba, you touched on it earlier, about the sector having this hidden set of codes. So actually, some of the things that interviewees described to us was feeling that there was a hidden set of codes, and what you read on a web page isn't actually how it works in real life. And that if you are, say, not a native English speaker, or if you didn't grow up in the UK, or if you are neurodivergent, that sometimes it's very difficult to kind of understand and navigate this hidden set of codes, especially if you don't have that social capital. And some of the smaller organisations we spoke with certainly described feeling like they were competing with kind of the larger organisations when it came to social capital. We touched upon anchor organisations earlier, but absolutely, definitely, I think one of our recommendations around really supporting that ecosystem of anchor organisations, kind of really identifying those custodians of the kind of anti-oppression and anti-racism movement, and those organisations that are able to support and work with the smaller community organisations, whether that is through acting as interpreters and translators, or supporting with applications, or supporting with kind of impact and outcomes management, definitely investing into that landscape of anchor organisations. I will kind of finish with the last two. One definitely around improving internal representation and being able to communicate that, and being able to be transparent about things like the internal makeup of your organisation. So publishing data on what the internal staff team looks like, and sharing steps on what's been taken to support existing staff to address gaps. So how are you building knowledge? What training are you embarking on? And a quite simple one, but make team profiles personable, accessible, and visible. It's quite a simple step. Most of us have those team bios on the websites, but actually making those really kind of accessible so that people are able to see kind of the human behind the funding process or the funding application. And then, a last one that I'll end on today, and I think today's a really good start of this, and really appreciate Power to Change giving us the opportunity to do this, but being able to share the knowledge and collaborate as funders and infrastructure organisations. There was a real recognition that those skills and knowledges need to be further developed within internal staff teams, but also shared and absorbed across the sector. And we'd really recommend that funding and infrastructure organisations continue to work together to build their internal capacity and share knowledge, whether that is through publishing blogs and data, or creating peer networks, or sharing knowledge through webinars and workshops. We'd really kind of strongly sort of recommend that funding and infrastructure organisations carry on sort of sharing that knowledge. So I will pause for the last time today and just bring Edward, Liba, and Rachel back into the conversation, just to hear your kind of final thoughts and reflections. And what we'll then do is just move on to Q&A. So yeah, Edward.
Thank you once again.
You.
In the interest of keeping this extremely short, I think if we combine the learning from the infrastructure interviewees and the recommendations, I think it coalesces into an overall picture of aspiration for us that getting these things right needs to become not a bolt-on, it needs to become a core part of what grant making is. And we really want to centralize it to the point where failing to do any of the recommendations or other things that are prompted by this work but haven't been explicitly stated here, failing to do them is failing to do our role correctly, our role diligently, failing to do it without discrimination, without marginalizing people. So to me, it's that there's an overall picture being built here, and making that core to the identity of what it means to be a grant maker is incredibly important and is the right direction to take. I keep it very short so we get more Q&A.
Appreciated. Liba and Rachel, how about you both?
Yeah, it's really amazing to be part of this research, and very happy with the overall report and thing that's been produced as a result of this. And I just want to highlight the very systemic, structural, and institutional barriers that have been faced a lot of these organizations who face these things for many years. And for me, it's about addressing those root causes of what's driving them, and a focus around shifting culture, shifting behavior, shifting norms within organizations that will lead to better practice, in my opinion. And just echoing what Rachel was saying, which is around that intersectional approach, getting a kind of holistic and all the different forms of oppression, discrimination that exists, that we can kind of address them in relation to that kind of framework. And then just a kind of final point is that, yeah, I think that hopefully this acts as a kind of wake up for our community sector and the kind of infrastructure sector and the funding sector. I'm really hoping that some of these recommendations get put into practice, and there is kind of further accountability when it comes to things around supporting marginalized community groups, because often, as has been documented, they've been excluded and not necessarily taken on board. So hopefully with this kind of research and the reviews and the recommendations and this event, there'll be further work that moves this in the kind of right direction towards greater equity, greater justice for all of us.
Yeah, thanks, Liba.
And I'll just jump in to say I gave you all like a treatise earlier. So I think I am very excited to hear your questions. So I think I'll skip any more thoughts I had about the infrastructure orgs. David.
Yeah, David.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just going to jump in with a very quick point. Just on the kind of collaboration side, I think during COVID, there was a lot more collaboration from infrastructure organisations and funders, and that was kind of welcomed when we were speaking to some of the community businesses in terms of, you know, simplified funding processes, joint parts, all that kind of stuff. And it seems as though everyone's kind of retreated back from that, you know, after COVID. And I think it's also worth recognising that, you know, the infrastructure organisations and funders are kind of partially in competition with each other as well. So that affects the ability to kind of work together and simplify things for community businesses. So yeah, just on I guess just echoing your point around all the finding around the importance of collaboration and working together and so on.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. Summer, I'll hand over to you if you want to.
Yeah, of course. So first question, I think, is probably more for Edward from Jennifer, who'd like to understand a little bit more about how we sort of share our intelligence with funders, policymakers, you know, all the decision makers to really break down those barriers.
It helps if I mute myself. I'm going to keep it brief as well because we want more Q&A. But we're doing our best to kind of make everything as accessible as possible. So over the last 12 months, we've published a couple of blogs about kind of the steps we've taken to get where we are now. And we're obviously publishing this research and all the recommendations that come from this research. And we're having these sessions to kind of share some of that. What we're planning to do is to take the learning from this and all of the internal stuff that we've got, and we're trying to build an approach for equity in grant making. And while we're doing that, we hope to be doing learning and sharing that learning as well. So to us, this is kind of stage 2 in a process of how we got where we are, what the research is telling us, which is the stage we're at now, and that we're sharing that. And then we hope to at least prototype as many of the approaches as we can to have kind of positive impacts. And we want to be publishing how we did that as well. And, you know, not just how we did it and what the successes were, but what the pain points were, what bits didn't work, and all that kind of stuff. So we are trying to expand kind of our internal reporting on DEI stuff over the next 12 months to include as much of this stuff as we can. I think we're probably going to be getting a dedicated DEI area of our website to start to host some of this research and some of the learning, because it's really beginning to build up to a point where scattered blogs and scattered research reports aren't so helpful anymore, where we really kind of just want a place for Power to Change this learning to be shared. But our intention is to share everything. Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Great. Next question is from Vida. I'm not sure if I've pronounced that properly. Please correct me if I haven't. What would be considered as best practice to build trust between community business and funders? So I guess Ishita or Edward, this might be for both of you.
Well, I'm actually going to ask that Lisa shares, because I've seen that Lisa's replied in the chat. I'm just wondering if we've still got her.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, go on, Lisa. Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. Oh, I just thought I'd share some of our reflections from managing the Community Business Fund for Power to Change. Sorry, I'm Lisa from Social Investment Business, Head of Grants there. And we take a very relational approach, and I think that really speaks to the findings of this research, that building that trust is key to really supporting organisations. And for us, it's about getting to know those organisations, understanding what's happening for them on the ground. Obviously, the pandemic did interrupt our visits, but we did stay in very close contact with community businesses throughout that period to really understand the challenges they were facing and to support them through being more flexible with our funding and helping them to pivot where necessary. But we are getting out now a bit more, because I think it's really important for us to reconnect and to actually understand what's going on for them on the ground and see the circumstances that they're delivering in. So that's one of the areas of good practice I hope are helpful.
Yeah, of course. I'm just going to add and build to that, Lisa, because I've got a couple of examples. And I think actually that also part of my response will answer John's question, who's asked, have you got any examples of what funders are doing rather than just challenges and recommendations? So yes, we do have examples of what funders are doing, and these are the examples that we've sourced from community businesses. And so one of the examples that came up was the Baobab Network, who have, I can see you nodding your head, Lisa. So the Baobab Network and was often cited as an example of best practice. And there was lots of little different things. And actually, Baobab allows you to submit your application in different formats. So you can do video, audio, written. Another one of the things that they put in place, which was really seen to kind of really build that trust, is they source kind of grant reviewers from their membership network, and their grant reviewers have lived experience. So, for example, in their racial justice fund, they, alongside kind of getting applications to the fund, they also recruited peer grant reviewers that would support in making the decision, so that that lived experience was actually part of the decision-making process. Another kind of example of best practice that came up quite often was the CARES family, who run a program called the Multiplier Effect. And this was, cited as a kind of a really positive experience of working with a support organisation. And one of the things that CARES family have in place is kind of that desire and appetite to work with individuals whose organisations aren't registered, who aren't incorporated, and kind of meet them where they are at their journey. So that was also kind of really seen as an example of best practice. There were also lots of other little examples that surfaced. So I think other kind of organisations that were mentioned were Girl Dreamer, who kind of run a small fund. It's just kind of one-off £500 pot, but inherently kind of the organisation is rooted in their community, really understand the community, and then distribute that fund for their community. So that was also kind of given as an example of building trust. But actually, when we looked at the best practice examples that were mentioned repeatedly, one of the things that really, I think, was apparent to us was how important that internal representation and makeup is to what you're signaling externally. So alongside having kind of more accessible processes in place, or different options for being able to apply to things, when it came to best practice, one of the things that people really valued in terms of building trust was seeing the internal makeup of staff teams, and seeing kind of staff teams that had lived experience, or just a commitment to understanding the experiences of different marginalised people. yeah, Summer, will hand back over to you for any more questions.
I think the only other one that's in there from Hazel is quite similar. I think we covered that, but please speak up, Hazel, if you don't feel like we have covered that.
No, I think it's covered. I'm just hugely aware when people are time pressured, you know, it can be tricky applying for funders, and I've been through the experience myself in a past life, and actually I'm going through it locally in my own local community. So it's how can you make it as easy as possible is a key question, and I think that is a funder's responsibility on the website to make it crystal clear where funding goes. But no, I've hugely enjoyed it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Hazel.
Thanks. Jennifer, you put your hand up.
Yes, thank you. It's been really insightful for me as a leader of community business to hear from infrastructure organisations. I think what's important to share from our point of view is what does marginalisation looks like, because it can be trendy in the media. It can be trendy because of politics or unpopular because of how certain things are being portrayed. But even within communities, marginalisation means something very different in geographical areas. One of the useful things and refreshing things, I'm just in the final stages of a first age Henry Smith funding application. And the first real question it asks, I've just got it finding at the moment, is what's happening in your local community and what challenges is it facing? A really good opening question, because not only will that test us as an organisation, but give us a real opportunity to explain what our community looks like, which may not necessarily be something a funder understands. I'm sure you do your research, but if the research is going to be based upon statistics, what is popular, often it's very difficult to get to either deep-rooted issues. In a place where I am in Sandwell, deprivation, we're already in the lowest in terms of deprivation. Cost of living and such likes has another impact on that. So therefore, often we're trying to address an issue that's decades old, and I'm sure that's goes on in many communities, but those marginalised communities emerge when new issues are piled on top of others. So it's really important that funders and infrastructure organisations understand that. I'm sure they do, but give applicants an opportunity to talk about what that looks like for them. I just wanted to share that with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Jennifer. And honestly, we heard that so strongly. And you know, people we spoke to talked about that need or that feeling that you have to kind of use things like deprivation indexes or census data to validate the need that your community has. But actually local communities are so different, but then people within those local communities are so different, and marginalization very rarely is just one thing. I think, and you know, that's what we're trying to get at with holding space for that complexity and for that nuance. You know, one of the people that we spoke with kind of described he runs Hackney Chinese Community Services, and one of the things that he really touched upon was how the census data actually only asks about Chinese ethnicity. It doesn't ask for East and Southeast Asian. So actually within their local community, they have a huge population of people that they're serving and working with who are East and Southeast Asian, but they can't validate those numbers using census data because that's not even in the census data. So actually, like, that complexity, that nuance of what does a local community look like, who's in it, who makes it up, and then what are the communities within that community, being able to kind of, yeah, just have those like almost human conversations around that was something that came out really strongly. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
Have any other questions or reflections?
I've got one, which is a tricky one, I think, for funders, because one of the points that came up in the research was about why they don't use more of their endowment, and and their own kind of wealth, I guess, to invest in their capacity to be more participatory and more, you know, to raise their own awareness. And I think that is a tricky one. But I know that actually the Charities Act's changing later this year, isn't it, to allow foundations to use more of their endowment, and that might have an impact. But I wondered about what others thought about that sort of insight, and how we could encourage our boards and others to open up a bit more so that we can invest actually in our capacity, because I think you're right that we could do a lot more in this space if we had that capacity.
Yeah, Vida.
Hi, thank you, Ishita and Power to Change and Locality for this. I was just about to post a message to that effect, but I just want to say that verbally. Interesting question, not least for us as a foundation at ESME that has an endowment, and these are very live questions for us as a foundation. One of the things that ESME is known for is for its social investment carve out. And that has been really helpful for us, not least in terms of having an allocation that sits very close to our strategic aims. And I think that's the key thing, that, you know, strategically, that's a narrative that our trustees understand. It's not just a pot of money that sits alongside, it is very much deployed to support the strategic aims, and the team that have been managing that piece of work are very highly skilled in understanding the strategy and the challenges of, especially around supporting, you know, marginalized communities with social investment, understanding, you know, that for a lot of communities, the idea of taking on debt is really difficult. So what other vehicles are more accessible, and the language that sits around that. So I think from an endowment point of view, it's where that's how we've tried to demonstrate it in terms of carving out part of our endowment to test and learn and to help our trustees understand that. And then there's always the opportunity of, you know, when a lot of the challenges, the learning, the mistakes come back, because that's also part of, you know, investing in community businesses and supporting them to learn as well as us as a foundation and others in the sector. It's how that then enables trustees to better understand, you know, start to ask questions about the rest of the endowment. What does it mean for how your endowment is invested globally? It's not just about how you on grant or on invest within your strategy, but it's also conversations about the whole endowment. And these things take time. They do take time. It's not an overnight quick fix thing. You are, as you know, some of you have already said, dealing with historic systems and ways of working that you have to move at a pace that is, you know, you have to be pacey, but you also have to be mindful that, and you have to hold those two things in tension, which sometimes is really, really difficult. But it's, you know, it's where there are opportunities to look at your endowment, think about how can we be really creative about how we use our, you know, our allocation and what we have been gifted, because it is a gift. And being, you know, conscious that the gift that we give is kind of about ensuring that future generation, future communities, future businesses are better supported. I also wanted to ask a question and just raise a question and a point. So I'm in the middle of writing board papers, and one of the things that I'm focusing in on is the dormant asset scheme, of which, you know, money has been supposedly allocated through the likes of Big Society Capital and the Access Fund to support community businesses and community, you know, community investment, and how this piece of work that you have done here, alongside other pieces of work like the Adeboali Commission, can better support the kind of messages around ensuring that marginalised communities of different identities, we don't lose the opportunity to access that 76 million and what will be 890 million, you know, the overall 890 million that has been made available, and more money that will be coming out in later releases as well. Because I think there are certain moments in time where large amounts of money are released into the system, and it does skew things depending on where things go. And I think this comes back to the trust element, that when decisions are made by whether it be Treasury, whether it be DCMS, whether it be trusts and foundations, and money being available, kind of demonstrating where that money goes, who has, you know, power to have conversations about how that money is allocated. If there's a continual kind of, you know, response that is exclusionary, that's when trust gets further eroded, and making up that trust is even harder. So I don't know if people had thoughts about that. I know we've got a minute. Sorry, I've taken a lot of time, but that is something that might be for another time. But just to say thank you so much. It's been really insightful and instructive. So thank you.
Not at all. Thank you so much for your thoughts and for the question. I will say I'm conscious of time, so if people need to drop off, please drop off. But I'm going to answer your question because I'm so glad you asked it. But it was really interesting actually. So I was following the dormant assets piece as we were doing this research. Although I think that the actual kind of public decision was released after we'd wrapped up the interviews. But I think there is absolutely an amazing opportunity there. And actually one of the kind of funders that took part in this was Access, but were part of the interviews, and the Walden Commission report was part of the evidence review. So has very much factored our thinking. And what I will say is that I think we're seeing kind of, you know, I don't know if you've been following the work of Pathways, but that's really worth following in the sector at the moment, as well as the Growth Impact Fund. And I know some of the work the Social Investment Business does, specifically with Access. But it is really interesting because I think that is quite like a pivotal moment of having more dormant assets released, and I think also kind of a signal to the sector about the long-term future of dormant assets. But definitely take your point on, if it continues to be exclusionary, how do you kind of shift that? But yeah, I'm really keen to hear anyone else's thoughts on this. Anyone got any more thoughts on dormant assets?
Just agreeing. I just wanted to agree with everything that Vida just said. And, you know, I really think that we should take both this research and other research into that space, because, you know, that's a lot of money, and it can do some great stuff. So, but I think it's encouraging that so many of those that are, you know, part of this work are involved in this research, and I think that how we take this forward is going to be key.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also just in like the spirit of like the collaboration and knowledge sharing that we were talking about, if there are any of these conversations that you would like to pick up afterwards, please do drop me an email specifically on dormant assets. I have very many thoughts about it. So I'm really keen to pick up some of that conversation. But otherwise for today, I will just say thank you so much to all of you for joining us, to Locality for all of your support through this research, and for Power to Change for giving us the opportunity. It really was a privilege, because we learned from every single person that we spoke to, and that was, you know, 10 funders and infrastructure organisations and 27 community businesses. And we feel kind of very lucky to have been able to be on that journey with all of them and share this back. So yeah, just thank you to all of you for joining the conversation today. We are going to be sharing the exact summary and the full report, and please do stay in touch with us if you've got any more questions. And yeah, I think this recording will potentially also go, we'll share it with all of the attendees afterwards. But if not,